In order to understand how Earth's climate can change so dramatically, we're going to have to understand the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle describes the transfer of carbon between four major reservoirs on Earth. By reservoirs, we just mean sort of places in the Earth system where carbon is stored. So the four major reservoirs are: one, so the four major reservoirs are the atmosphere, the biosphere, by which we mean sort of living things, right, plants and animals, the hydrosphere, which is mostly got to do with the oceans, but also lakes and rivers, and the geosphere, which is basically rocks. So these are the four major reservoirs of carbon on Earth, and the carbon cycle describes how carbon moves around between these four reservoirs. Carbon also exists in different states in all of these different kinds of reservoirs. So in the atmosphere, carbon is mostly present as CO2 gas, carbon dioxide. In the biosphere, carbon is locked up in organic matter. So you and I and all the plants and animals out there are mostly made up of some combination of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. There's many different kinds of molecules that make up organic carbon, but we're going to use a sort of generic version of that that's basically a combination of carbon and water. So CH2O is going to just kind of substitute for all the myriad kinds of organic carbon and organic matter that exist out in the world. In the hydrosphere, carbon can exist either as dissolved gas in ocean water as CO2, or it can also exist in molecules called bicarbonate, HCO3. And there's several other sort of molecules that exist in the ocean that have carbon in them that we may or may not get to. And then finally, in the geosphere, carbon locked up in rocks is often in the form of calcite, calcium carbonate. Okay, so part of this transfer of carbon between these reservoirs is going to be changing forms between gas, organic matter, and rocks. So first, let's think about a pretty familiar interaction involving carbon between the atmosphere and the biosphere. And that's got to do with plants and animals photosynthesizing and respiring. So plants pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere when they photosynthesize. Right? Plants have this amazing ability to make their own food by combining sunlight and nutrients, including CO2. And so a general chemical reaction, a simplified chemical reaction for photosynthesis can be written like this. So plants consume CO2 and water, and they, in addition to sunlight and other nutrients, and they convert that into organic matter, right? They sort of make their own food and grow their own bodies. So this is sort of a general equation for plant matter, CH2O, right? Just general organic matter. And they release oxygen, O2, when they do that, right? So sort of think of plants, inhaling CO2 and exhaling O2. So animals do this same reaction, but in reverse when we respire or breathe, right? We turn sugars and oxygen into energy that helps us live, and we breathe out carbon dioxide and water vapor. So to illustrate that, we'll draw some happy little trees. Some happy trees. Happy trees don't know anything about coronavirus, right? So these happy trees take in CO2 from the atmosphere, and they convert that into organic matter and release oxygen. And then plants and animals like us, or excuse me, not plants and animals like us, inhale that CO2 and then exhale, they inhale that O2 and exhale CO2, carbon dioxide, which is then used by plants in photosynthesis. Of course, we also just exhale CO2 to the atmosphere, and we inhale O2 from the atmosphere. Right, so plants and animals are constantly exchanging carbon between the biosphere and the atmosphere through photosynthesis and respiration. Of course, plants and animals also eventually die. So when these happy trees fall down and just become logs on the ground, right, they die. And then the organic matter of plants and animals decay. Okay, so when plants and animals die, their bodies will decay, and that decay process is basically like respiration. If there is free oxygen available, if there's O2 hanging around, then the bodies of dead organic things are going to become oxidized, and carbon will be released back into the atmosphere in, again, sort of this respiration equation, which I'll write down here again. So free oxygen and dead organic matter will react to release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, and along with some H2O. Some carbon will also become stored sort of long term in soils, right? So sort of dead leaves and and sticks and twigs and everything sort of break down and become part of soils. Okay, so plants and animals are constantly exchanging, carbon dioxide and organic matter with the atmosphere through photosynthesis, respiration. And then when plants and animals die, their bodies decay and become oxidized, which returns some of their organic carbon back to the atmosphere in the form of CO2. A small amount ends up becoming stored in soils sort of more long term. But now let's examine how the atmosphere interacts with the hydrosphere. So when we start thinking about the hydrosphere, right, the water part of the ocean, or the water part of the earth, which is mostly the ocean, it's going to be useful to divide the ocean up into two different parts. The uppermost ocean, which is sort of very, very well mixed. It's stirred up by wind and waves, which means it exchanges CO2 and oxygen with the atmosphere quite readily. So because the upper ocean is mixed up by wind and waves, it's constantly exchanging CO2 with the atmosphere and O2. So the consequence of that is that there's a lot of dissolved CO2 in ocean water, and there's also a lot of dissolved O2 in ocean water, right? And that's what allows fish to breathe underwater. Fish pull dissolved oxygen out of the ocean with their gills and use that to respire. But the reason that they're able to do that is because this upper layer of ocean is sort of mixed up by the wave and wind action that sort of causes a lot of stirred up and mixing in this uppermost layer. Okay, so just like on land, there's a lot of life in the ocean. So there's, ocean plants, things like plankton that will do photosynthesis. And there's also, of course, animals like fish, right? So the same processes that are going on land with our happy trees photosynthesizing and our plants and our animals respiring also happens in the upper ocean. So just like life on land, life in the ocean photosynthesizes, respires, and dies. There's a big difference though, and that's that when life in the ocean does die, it sinks into the deep ocean. All right, so dead fish, dead plankton, all these, thousands of different kinds, millions of different kinds of life forms in the ocean die and sink down to the bottom of the ocean. So you might think that all this organic carbon would just pile up at the bottom of the ocean. However, it turns out that due to sort of large-scale ocean circulation, the deep oceans are actually very rich in oxygen and O2. So deep ocean circulation brings O2 down into the deep ocean, and ultimately the ocean circulation sort of brings things back up to the surface as well, right? So there's this sort of large-scale ocean circulation. So that means that the deep waters are full of free O2, and dead organic matter can be oxidized just like it is above land. In fact, even more efficiently. Okay, so large-scale ocean circulation means that these deep waters have oxygen, and that when these dead fish and dead critters die, their bodies can be oxidized, and carbon is going to be released into the ocean. Only this time it's going to be released as dissolved CO2. This dissolved CO2 might react to form other molecules like bicarbonate, but basically we're sort of releasing CO2 into the deep ocean and keeping it there until it can eventually cycle back around and be brought to the surface where it will exchange with the atmosphere again. This interplay between the hydrosphere and the atmosphere is actually very important because about 50% of all about 50% of all photosynthesis that happens on Earth actually happens in the ocean, and there's tons of life in the ocean. So this is a huge, cycle that humans don't really think about because we live on land. But this hydrosphere, biosphere, and atmosphere interaction in the oceans is super important for understanding the climate cycle. So 50% of all the photosynthesis on Earth happens in the ocean. All right, so that's some of the interactions that happen between the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the hydrosphere. But how is the geosphere involved? Well, it turns out that although most of the organic matter that lives in the ocean dies and falls to the bottom of the sea ends up being oxidized and broken down, a very small amount of it will become deposited on the seafloor. So a very small amount of dead organic matter will pile up on the bottom of the seafloor, and that will become trapped in rocks for the long-term geologic record. So a very small amount of this material, about 0.01%, is actually going to be buried in sediment and turned into rocks at the bottom of the ocean. So the importance of these different reservoirs and the processes that exchange carbon between them it becomes clear how important they are when we consider the size of each one of the reservoirs, how much carbon is held in each reservoir, and the timescales over which they exchange that carbon. So it's estimated that the atmosphere, sort of pre-industrial, so before about the 1800s, the atmosphere would have contained about 600 gigatons of carbon. Okay, so a gigaton is a billion tons. So 600 billion tons of carbon. And it's estimated that the biosphere, namely sort of vegetation, accounts for about 610 gigatons. It's estimated that the upper ocean, this part of the ocean that is mixed by wind and waves, contains about 1,000 gigatons of carbon. Okay, so that's 1,000 billion. Remember, 1,000 billion. It's a lot of carbon. The deep ocean, remember, right, this part that's sort of not in direct communication with the atmosphere, the deep ocean is estimated to contain about 38,000 gigatons of carbon. So 1,000 gigatons or 38,000 gigatons is, that's thousands of billions. We're into trillions. So 1 trillion tons of carbon or 38 trillion tons of carbon. The geosphere, rocks and sediments right at the bottom of the ocean, included in continents, is estimated to contain 66 million gigatons of carbon. Okay, 66 million gigatons. That's a total of 15 zeros. I believe that's 66 quadrillion tons. I had to look it up. 15 zeros is a quadrillion, so 66 quadrillion tons of carbon. Okay, so you can see that the geosphere is by far the largest reservoir of carbon on Earth, followed by the deep ocean, but it's not even close. And then the atmosphere and the biosphere and the upper ocean are pretty small reservoirs of carbon. Okay, so these three small reservoirs, the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the upper ocean, they are all sort of communicating and exchanging carbon on a very short time scale, sort of years to decades even. The deep ocean is sort of communicating with the atmosphere on a time scale that's more like thousands of years. So it takes about 2,000 years for one cycle of deep ocean circulation to bring water from the surface all the way down and back. It's about 2,000 years, and that can vary depending on ocean circulation. So this sort of deep ocean communicating with the atmosphere is on the order of thousands of years. But the geosphere, right, the rocks and sediment that contain carbon are only exchanging with other reservoirs on a time scale of millions of years. So once carbon gets locked up inside of rocks, it's there for the long haul. It stays there for a very long time. The exchange of carbon between the geosphere and the other spheres is so important, though, that we need to dive into that in a little bit more detail and talk about how, once carbon gets into the rock record, how does it get out of the rock record?